Blackwells Kingdom, Washington, D.C., 1920. Lillian Wright had locked away Major Nathaniel Blackwood's war letters after his death. But tonight, a new one lay atop the old stack. The paper was crisp, the ink still wet. Lillian, they're watching. Don't trust the telegrams. Chapter 1. The letter that wasn't there yesterday. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11, each toll a heavy thud against the silence of Lillian Wright's Georgetown townhouse. 2 years. 2 years since the telegram had arrived, stark and cruel, bearing the news of Major Nathaniel Blackwood's death in the Argonne forest. 2 years since she had last touched the small, cedar-lined box where she kept his letters tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon. She hadn't needed to touch them, the words were etched into her memory, each whispered promise, each declaration of a love that was supposed to defy even the ravages of war. Tonight, however, something had drawn her to the box. A restlessness, perhaps a prickling unease that had settled over her like a damp fog rolling in from the Potomac. She'd been unable to shake the feeling all evening, a sense of being watched, of something being amiss, though the house was still and quiet, the servants long since retired to their quarters. She'd tried to distract herself with a book, then with needlepoint, but the feeling persisted, a subtle vibration in the air, like the hum of distant artillery fire she'd only ever imagined. The box sat on the top shelf of her late husband's library, a room she rarely entered anymore. Dust motes danced in the faint moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the spines of leather-bound volumes on military strategy and law. Arthur's world, not hers. She pulled a small, velvet-covered footstool to the shelves and reached for the box. It was heavier than she remembered, the weight of unshed tears, of a future stolen. She carried it to the small, mahogany writing desk near the window, the only piece of furniture in the room that felt truly hers. The desk had been a gift from Nathaniel, a whispered promise of a life together after the war, a life filled with words and shared secrets, not the stiff formality of her marriage to Arthur. She sat down, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood, the scent of cedar and old paper rising from the box as she lifted the lid. The letters were there, just as she had left them. The familiar, slightly slanted handwriting of Nathaniel, bold and confident, even when describing the horrors of the trenches. She knew them by heart, the early ones filled with a youthful exuberance, a belief in the glory of war, gradually fading into a weary acceptance of its brutality, yet always, always, laced with his unwavering love for her. She could almost hear his voice, deep and resonant, whispering the words as she read them in her mind. But there was a new letter. It lay on top of the others, the paper crisp and white, a stark contrast to the yellowed, fragile pages beneath. The ink was still slightly wet, a deep, midnight blue that seemed to absorb the dim light. It was Nathaniel's handwriting, undeniably so. The familiar loop of the N, the sharp, decisive stroke of the T. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was impossible. He was dead. She had mourned him, buried him, in her heart if not in the earth. Her hand trembled as she picked up the letter. The paper felt strangely warm, almost alive, beneath her fingertips. It was a single sheet folded once. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The words were few, stark and unsettling, written in the same hurried, almost frantic script she had come to recognize in his later letters from the front. Lillian, they're watching. Don't trust the telegrams. That was all. No signature, no date, just those chilling words. They screamed at her from the page, a desperate warning from beyond the grave. They're watching.
Who were they?
And the telegrams, what telegrams? The one announcing his death? Was it a lie? Could he still be alive? The thought was a spark of hope in the darkness, a fragile flame flickering in the wind of her disbelief. She read the letter again, and again, each time the words seemed to burrow deeper into her mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear. Her carefully constructed world, the one she had built around the acceptance of his death, the quiet, predictable routine of her life as a widow, began to crumble around her. She looked around the room, the shadows seeming to deepen, to press in on her. The familiar objects, the bookshelves, the heavy drapes, the portrait of Arthur above the fireplace, his stern gaze seeming to follow her now seemed alien, menacing. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the suffocating confines of the house. But where could she go? Who could she trust? The letter had warned her not to trust the telegrams, but who else could she turn to? Her friends, the society ladies of Washington, with their carefully guarded secrets and polite smiles? Her husband's colleagues, the men of power and influence who moved in the shadowy corridors of government? She thought of Eleanor, her closest confidant, a woman she had known since childhood. But Eleanor was married to a senator, a man deeply involved in the war effort, a man who would undoubtedly dismiss her fears as the ravings of a grieving widow. And then there was Captain James Harding, Arthur's former aide-de-camp, a man who had always been kind, respectful, perhaps even a little too attentive. He had been the one to deliver the telegram, the one to offer his condolences, his hand lingering a little too long on hers. Had she imagined the flicker of something in his eyes, something that went beyond sympathy? She ran a hand through her hair, her fingers tangling in the loose strands. She was a woman alone, in a world of secrets and lies, a world where the lines between friend and foe were blurred, where even the dead could speak. And the dead were warning her. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back on top of the others. She closed the box, the cedar scent now mingled with a faint, metallic tang of fear. She had to be careful, had to be discreet. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not until she knew the truth. The grandfather clock chimed midnight. The sound seemed to echo the pounding of her heart, a relentless rhythm of dread and determination. She had to find out what happened to Nathaniel. She had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The letter was a lifeline, a message from the past, a call to action. And she would answer it. She looked back to the box, her resolve strengthening, her heart both breaking and mending at the same time. Chapter 2. Whispers in the drawing room. The morning light, pale and watery, did little to dispel the shadows that clung to Lillian's mind. Sleep had eluded her, replaced by a restless turning, punctuated by fragments of dreams. Nathaniel's face, blurred and indistinct, the sound of gunfire, the chilling words of the letter echoing in the darkness. She had risen early, dressed in a simple gray dress, the color of mourning, the color of uncertainty. The house was quiet, the servants moving with their usual hushed efficiency. She found them, as always, a somber comfort. Mrs. Davis, the housekeeper, a stout, matronly woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted her with a concerned look. "You look pale, Mrs. Wright. Are you feeling unwell?" Lillian forced a smile. "Just a touch of a headache, Mrs. Davis. Nothing to worry about." She couldn't tell anyone about the letter. Not yet. She took her breakfast in the small, sunlit morning room, a plate of toast and a pot of tea untouched before her. The newspaper lay folded beside her plate, the headlines proclaiming the latest developments in the ongoing peace negotiations, the ongoing struggles to rebuild a world shattered by war. She scanned the articles, her eyes searching for something, anything, that might shed light on Nathaniel's cryptic message. But there was nothing, only the usual political posturing, the carefully worded pronouncements of diplomats and politicians. She pushed the plate away, her appetite gone. The silence of the room pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic beat of her heart. She needed to talk to someone, to find a way to unravel the mystery of the letter, but who could she trust? An invitation, delivered by hand that afternoon, offered a temporary distraction, a chance to step outside the suffocating confines of her own thoughts. It was from Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the wife of the British ambassador, a woman known for her lavish parties and her sharp wit. Lady Ashworth was hosting a small tea party, a gathering of some of Washington's most influential women. Lillian hesitated. She had largely withdrawn from society since Nathaniel's death, finding the endless round of parties and receptions a hollow charade. But Lady Ashworth was a shrewd observer, a woman who saw more than she let on, and perhaps Amidst the polite conversation and the delicate china cups, she might find a clue, a whisper of information that could help her. The Ashworth drawing room was a symphony of pastel colors and delicate fabrics, the air filled with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. The women, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, gathered in small groups, their voices a low hum of gossip and intrigue. Lillian felt a familiar wave of unease wash over her, the feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging. Lady Ashworth, a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, greeted her with a warm smile. "Lillian, my dear, so good of you to come. You've been missed." "Thank you, Lady Ashworth. It's good to be here," Lillian replied, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Lady Ashworth studied her for a moment, her gaze sharp and perceptive. "You look troubled, my dear. Is everything all right?" Lillian hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just a bit tired, I'm afraid. The anniversary of my husband's death always takes its toll." Lady Ashworth nodded sympathetically. "Of course, my dear. It must be difficult. But you must try to move forward, to find some joy in life again." She paused, then added, her voice lower, "And perhaps a new companionship?" Lillian felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She knew what Lady Ashworth was implying. There had been whispers, of course, rumors of eligible bachelors, of men who had expressed an interest in her. But she had dismissed them all, her heart still firmly locked in the past, in the memory of Nathaniel. She changed the subject, steering the conversation towards the latest political gossip, the upcoming elections, the ongoing debate about the League of Nations. Lady Ashworth followed her lead, her eyes twinkling with amusement, but Lillian could sense that she hadn't forgotten her earlier observation. As the afternoon wore on, Lillian found herself drawn into a conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Harding, her childhood friend, and the wife of Captain James Harding. Eleanor was a petite, vivacious woman with a quick wit and a generous heart. She had been a constant source of support during Lillian's darkest days, a shoulder to cry on, a voice of reason. "You seem preoccupied," Lillian, Eleanor said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is something wrong?" Lillian hesitated, then decided to confide in her, at least partially. "I received a strange letter," she said, her voice low. "A letter that doesn't make sense." Eleanor's eyes widened. "A letter? From whom?" I can't say," Lillian replied, glancing around the room to make sure they weren't being overheard. "But it had mentioned telegrams. And it warned me not to trust them." Eleanor's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "Telegrams? What telegrams?" Lillian shook her head. "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out." She paused, then added, It's unsettling, Eleanor. I feel like I'm being watched, like there's something going on that I don't understand." Eleanor reached out and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Lillian, you must be careful. Washington is a city of secrets, a place where nothing is as it seems. There are people here who would take advantage of your vulnerability." Lillian nodded, her heart pounding. She knew Eleanor was right. She had been naive, perhaps, to think that she could navigate this world alone. She needed help, and she needed it now. "Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I trust your husband?" "Captain Harding, he was Arthur's aide-de-camp. He knows things, doesn't he?" Eleanor's expression flickered with uncertainty. "James, he's a good man, Lillian. But he's also ambitious. He's deeply involved in the intelligence community. He keeps things close to his chest." Lillian's heart sank. She had hoped that Captain Harding might be an ally, a source of information. But Eleanor's words, her hesitant tone, suggested otherwise. As the tea party drew to a close, Lillian felt a growing sense of unease. The whispers in the drawing room, the veiled warnings, the guarded expressions, had only deepened her suspicion that something was terribly wrong. She had come seeking answers, but she had found only more questions. And the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by shadows, had intensified. She needed to find out what was happening to her beloved, and quickly. She just hoped she could. Chapter 3. The Telegram That Lied. The ride home was a blur of cobbled streets and gaslight lamps, the city lights shimmering through a thin veil of mist. Lillian sat huddled in the back of the hired car, her mind racing, replaying the conversations of the afternoon, searching for a hidden clue, a missed signal. Eleanor's warning echoed in her ears. Washington is a city of secrets. She arrived home to find a telegram waiting for her. It lay on the silver salver in the hallway, a stark white rectangle against the polished mahogany. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was from the War Department, the official seal embossed on the envelope. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the terse, official language. It was a confirmation, a reiteration of the original telegram that had announced Nathaniel's death. It stated, in cold, impersonal terms, that Major Nathaniel Blackwood had been killed in action on November 5, 1918, in the Argonne Forest, his body identified by his personal effects, his death confirmed by multiple witnesses. It offered condolences, expressed gratitude for his service, and offered assistance with any further inquiries. Lillian crumpled the telegram in her hand, her nails digging into the paper. It was a lie. She knew it. The letter, Nathaniel's letter, had warned her. But how could she prove it? The War Department, the official records, the eyewitness accounts, it was all a carefully constructed facade, a web of deceit designed to conceal the truth. She went to the library, to the cedar-lined box, and retrieved the original telegram, the one that had arrived 2 years ago. She compared the two, the original, yellowed and creased, the new one, crisp and stark. The wording was almost identical, the same cold, impersonal language, the same devastating message. But there was one difference, a subtle detail that she had missed before. The original telegram had been signed by a Colonel Richards, a name she vaguely remembered from Arthur's conversations. The new telegram, however, was signed by a General Davies, a name she didn't recognize. It was a small detail, perhaps insignificant, but it was a discrepancy, a crack in the otherwise seamless facade. She sat down at the writing desk, the two telegrams spread out before her, the letter from Nathaniel nestled between them. She needed to find out more about General Davies, about his connection to Nathaniel, about his role in the War Department. She remembered Arthur mentioning a directory, a register of military personnel, kept in his study. She found it on a lower shelf, a thick, leather-bound volume, filled with names, ranks, and assignments. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the columns of text, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found the entry for General Davies. He was a relatively recent appointment, promoted to his current rank just 6 months ago. His previous assignment had been in military intelligence, a shadowy branch of the Army responsible for gathering information, conducting espionage, and disseminating disinformation. A chill ran down her spine. Military intelligence. Eleanor had mentioned that Captain Harding was involved in the intelligence community. Could there be a connection? Could Harding be involved in this conspiracy, this elaborate deception? She thought back to the day Harding had delivered the original telegram, his somber expression, his carefully chosen words, his hand lingering on hers. Had it been sympathy or something else? Had he been playing a role, an actor in a carefully orchestrated drama? She needed to talk to him, to confront him, but she knew she couldn't do it directly. She needed to be subtle, to approach him indirectly, to find a way to get him to reveal the truth without alerting him to her suspicions. An idea began to form in her mind, a risky plan, a desperate gamble. She would use her social connections, her position as a respected widow, to gain access to Harding, to observe him, to probe him, to find a way to expose his lies. She would attend the upcoming embassy ball, a lavish affair hosted by the French ambassador, an event that Harding was sure to attend. It was a chance to mingle with the elite of Washington society, to gather information, to observe, to listen, and perhaps to find a way to unravel the truth about Nathaniel's fate. She knew the risks. She was stepping into a dangerous world, a world of spies and secrets, a world where one wrong move could have devastating consequences. But she was driven by a force stronger than fear, a force fueled by love and loss, by a desperate need to know the truth. She would play the role of the grieving widow, the vulnerable socialite, the unsuspecting pawn. She would use her charm, her wit, her intelligence, to navigate the treacherous waters of Washington society. And she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The lie needed to be confronted. Nathaniel deserved that. She deserved that. As she looked out at the ever-darkening sky, she began to silently plan. Chapter 4. A Ghost in Arlington. The next day dawned gray and overcast, mirroring Lillian's mood. The weight of the deception, the growing suspicion, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, pressed down on her. She needed a moment of solace, a place to gather her thoughts, to connect with the memory of Nathaniel. She decided to visit Arlington National Cemetery, the vast, rolling hills where so many soldiers, including Arthur, were buried. She hadn't been there since Arthur's funeral, the memory of that day still raw and painful. She had stood beside the grave, numb with grief, the sound of the bugle, the volley of rifle fire, echoing in her ears. She dressed in black, a simple, elegant dress, a veiled hat casting a shadow over her face. She took a taxi to the cemetery, the driver, a young man with a weary face, casting sympathetic glances at her in the rearview mirror. The cemetery was a city of the dead, a silent testament to the cost of war. Rows upon rows of white headstones stretched across the hills, each one marking a life lost, a story ended. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the wind. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the headstones, searching for Arthur's grave. She found it in a quiet corner, beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The inscription on the stone was simple: Arthur Wright, beloved husband, loyal soldier. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the cold marble, her thoughts drifting back to the years of her marriage. It had been a marriage of convenience, a union arranged by their families, a joining of two prominent Washington families. Arthur had been a kind man, a good man, but there had been no passion, no spark of true love. It had been a life of duty, of obligation, of quiet resignation. Her thoughts turned to Nathaniel, to the stolen moments, the whispered promises, the burning passion that had defied the constraints of her marriage, the horrors of war. He had been her escape, her salvation, her true love. And now, he was a ghost, a whisper from beyond the grave, a mystery she had to unravel. She decided to walk, to wander through the cemetery, to lose herself in the silence, in the memory of those who had fallen. As she walked, she noticed a figure in the distance, a man standing beside a newly dug grave. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his back to her, his head bowed. Something about him, the way he stood, the stillness of his posture, struck her as familiar. As she drew closer, she realized who it was. Captain James Harding. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark suit, a gray overcoat. He held a single white rose in his hand, his fingers tracing the delicate petals. He seemed lost in thought, oblivious to her presence. Lillian hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. She had planned to see him at the embassy ball, to engage him in a carefully orchestrated conversation. But this was an unexpected opportunity, a chance to observe him in a more unguarded moment. She took a deep breath and walked towards him, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass. He didn't seem to notice her until she was just a few feet away. He turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice a low murmur. I didn't expect to see you here." "Captain Harding," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. I came to visit my husband's grave." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the newly dug grave beside him. I came to pay my respects to a fallen comrade. Lieutenant Miller. He served with me in France." Lillian looked at the grave, the fresh earth still raw and exposed. A small, wooden cross marked the spot, bearing the lieutenant's name and rank. There were no flowers, no other signs of remembrance. "He died recently?" she asked, her voice soft. Harding nodded. He succumbed to his wounds. He was one of the best. A brave soldier, a loyal friend. Lillian could hear the genuine grief in his voice, the pain of loss that she knew so well. For a moment, she saw him not as a potential enemy, a possible conspirator, but as a fellow human being, grappling with the aftermath of war. But then, she remembered the telegrams, the letter, the whispers in the drawing room. She couldn't afford to be swayed by emotion, by sympathy. She had to be cautious, to be observant. It's hard to believe it's all over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The war, the fighting, and yet, the pain remains." Harding looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Yes," he said, his voice heavy. "The pain remains."
"And the secrets."
He paused, his gaze shifting back to the grave. "There are things, Mrs. Wright, things that happened during the war, things that are best left buried." Lillian's heart quickened. He was talking about secrets, about things that were best left hidden. Was he referring to Nathaniel? Was he admitting, indirectly, to his involvement in the deception? "But some secrets deserve to be uncovered," she said, her voice firm. "Some truths need to be brought to light." Harding looked at her again, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing his words, carefully choosing his response. "Be careful, Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice low and warning. "Some truths are dangerous. Some secrets are best left undisturbed." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing beside the grave, the white rose lying on the fresh earth, a stark reminder of the cost of war, the price of secrets. She watched his retreating back, wondering what he had wanted to say, or perhaps what he hadn't. Chapter 5. The Society of Shadows. The embassy ball was a glittering spectacle, a dazzling display of wealth and power. The French embassy, a grand, Beaux-Arts mansion on Colorama Road, was ablaze with light, the sounds of music and laughter spilling out into the night. Lillian, dressed in a shimmering gown of midnight blue, felt a familiar wave of unease as she stepped out of the hired car. She had spent the days since her encounter with Harding at Arlington in a state of heightened anxiety, replaying his words, searching for hidden meanings, trying to piece together the puzzle of Nathaniel's fate. She had delved deeper into Arthur's papers, searching for any clue, any reference to General Davies, to military intelligence, to anything that might shed light on the conspiracy. She had found a small, leather-bound notebook, tucked away in a drawer, filled with Arthur's cryptic notes, jotted down in his precise, meticulous handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane, lists of appointments, reminders of meetings, but one entry, dated just a few weeks before Arthur's death, caught her eye. Society of Shadows meeting at the Willard. The Willard Hotel was a Washington landmark, a haven for politicians, diplomats, and spies. The Society of Shadows, what was it? A secret society? A clandestine organization? The name itself sent a shiver down her spine. She had tried to find out more, searching through Arthur's papers, questioning Mrs. Davis, even discreetly inquiring with Eleanor, but she had found nothing. The Society of Shadows remained a mystery, a shadowy entity lurking in the background. Now, as she entered the ballroom, she scanned the faces, searching for Captain Harding, for General Davies, for any sign of recognition, any hint of the secret world that Arthur had hinted at. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of color and movement, the air thick with the scent of perfume, champagne, and cigar smoke. Men in formal attire, military uniforms, and diplomatic regalia mingled with women in elegant gowns, their jewels sparkling under the crystal chandeliers. The orchestra played a lively waltz, couples swirling across the polished floor. Lillian felt a hand on her arm. It was Lady Ashworth, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Lillian, my dear, you look stunning. But you also look like you're searching for someone. Or something." Lillian forced a smile. "Just taking in the spectacle, Lady Ashworth. It's quite a gathering." Lady Ashworth followed her gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly.
Yes.
The usual suspects. Politicians, diplomats, lobbyists, and a few others who prefer to remain in the shadows. Lillian's heart quickened. "The shadows?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Lady Ashworth smiled knowingly. "Washington is full of secrets, my dear. Secret societies, clandestine meetings, hidden agendas. It's all part of the game. Have you ever heard of a Society of Shadows?" Lillian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lady Ashworth's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes flickering with surprise. The Society of Shadows? Where did you hear that name? Lillian hesitated, then decided to be truthful, at least partially. I found a reference to it in my late husband's papers. Lady Ashworth studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Arthur was a man of many secrets, she said, her voice low. The Society of Shadows, it's not something to be discussed in polite company, my dear. It's a rather exclusive group. Men of power, men of influence, men who operate outside the usual channels. Lillian's heart pounded. This was it. This was the connection, the link to the conspiracy. Do you know anything about them? Their purpose? Their members? Lady Ashworth shook her head. I know very little, my dear. And what I do know, I'm not at liberty to divulge. But I can tell you this. They are powerful, they are ruthless, and they are not to be trifled with. She paused, then added, her voice warning, be careful, Lillian. You're playing with fire. Some secrets are best left buried. It was the same warning Harding had given her at Arlington. The same veiled threat. It only strengthened her resolve.
Just then she saw him.
Captain Harding, standing across the room, talking to a group of men in military uniform. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He nodded slightly, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Lillian excused herself from Lady Ashworth and made her way across the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached Harding, her smile carefully composed, her eyes searching his. Captain Harding, she said, her voice steady. A pleasure to see you again. Mrs. Wright, he replied, his voice polite, his expression guarded. You look radiant. Thank you, she said, her gaze unwavering. I was hoping we might have a moment to chat. He hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Shall we find a quieter spot? He led her to a small alcove, overlooking the gardens, the sounds of the ballroom muted by the thick velvet curtains. He offered her a glass of champagne, which she accepted, her hand trembling slightly. I wanted to ask you about something, she said, her voice low. Something you said at Arlington. About secrets. About things that are best left buried. Harding's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Wright. I think you do, she said, her voice firm. I think you know something about Major Blackwood's death. Something you're not telling me. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed. Major Blackwood is dead, Mrs. Wright. I delivered the telegram myself. I saw the reports. But there was another telegram, she said, her voice rising slightly. A recent one. Confirming his death. Signed by a General Davies. A man I believe is connected to military intelligence. Harding's face paled slightly. He took a step back, his hand instinctively moving towards his jacket pocket. I don't know anything about that, he said, his voice strained. You must be mistaken. I'm not mistaken, she said, her gaze unwavering. And I think you know more than you're letting on. I think you're involved in something to do with the Society of Shadows. The color drained from his face. He looked around, his eyes darting nervously. You shouldn't be talking about that, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It's dangerous. Dangerous for whom? She asked, her voice challenging. For you? For General Davies? Or for the truth? He didn't answer. He stood there, frozen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like guilt. And in that silence, Lillian knew she had to push before she lost her opportunity and the truth for good. Chapter 6. Nathaniel's Secret Code. Lillian pressed her advantage, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Tell me, Captain, she said, her voice low and steady, what really happened to Major Blackwood? Harding's eyes darted around the alcove, as if searching for an escape route. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his jaw clenched. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. I can't, he whispered. They'll kill me. Who will kill you? Lillian demanded, her grip tightening on her champagne glass. The Society of Shadows? General Davies? He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. They're everywhere. They have eyes and ears everywhere. But Nathaniel, he was one of them, wasn't he? Lillian asked, remembering Arthur's notebook entry. the cryptic reference to the society.
He was involved in something.
Something secret. Harding hesitated, then nodded again, slowly.
He was
recruited. Before he went to France, he was working undercover, gathering intelligence. On both sides. Lillian's mind reeled. Nathaniel a spy? Working for both sides? It was almost impossible to believe, yet it made a strange kind of sense. His letters from the front, the ones she had read and reread countless times, had always contained a certain guardedness, a sense of holding something back.
But why?
She asked, her voice trembling. Why would he do that? Why would he risk his life? He believed in it, Harding said, his voice barely audible. He believed in a higher purpose. A way to end the war, to bring about a lasting peace. Even if it meant working with the enemy. And the telegrams? Lillian asked, her voice sharp. The ones announcing his death. Were they part of the plan? Harding nodded. It was a cover. A way to protect him. To allow him to disappear. Disappear? Lillian repeated, her heart pounding. But where? Where is he? Harding shook his head. I don't know. I swear I don't know. He was supposed to contact us. But he never did. We thought he was dead. But he's not, Lillian said, her voice rising with a mixture of hope and disbelief. He sent me a letter. Just last night. He's alive. Harding stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. A letter? From Nathaniel?
But how?
Lillian pulled the letter from her evening bag, the paper crinkled and worn from being read and reread. She handed it to Harding, her hand trembling. He took the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, the cryptic message. Lillian, they're watching. Don't trust the telegrams. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. This changes everything, he said, his voice hoarse. If he's alive, then they'll be looking for him. And they'll be looking for you. I know, Lillian said, her voice steady. But I have to find him. I have to know the truth. Harding hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. He opened it, revealing a miniature photograph of a young woman with dark hair and piercing eyes. This was Nathaniel's, he said, his voice choked with emotion. He gave it to me before he disappeared. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. Lillian took the locket, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool metal. She opened it, her heart aching at the sight of the woman's face. She didn't recognize her. Who was she? Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her name was Anya, Harding said, his voice low. She was working with Nathaniel. She was a courier. She carried messages between him and his contacts. And where is she now? Lillian asked, her heart pounding with a sudden surge of hope. Harding shook his head. I don't know. She disappeared too. After Nathaniel. After the telegram. We thought they had killed her. Lillian closed the locket, her mind racing. Anya. The courier. She was the key, the link to Nathaniel. If she could find Anya, she might be able to find him. There's something else, Harding said, his voice hesitant. Nathaniel. He had a code. A way of communicating. In secret. He used it in his letters. To us. And to you. Lillian's eyes widened. A code? In his letters? She had read them countless times, searching for hidden meanings, but she had never noticed anything unusual. What kind of code? She asked, her voice urgent. It was a simple substitution cipher, Harding explained. He used flowers. Each flower represented a letter of the alphabet. He would weave them into his descriptions of the landscape, the weather. Seemingly innocuous details. Lillian's mind flashed back to Nathaniel's letters, the ones she had memorized, the ones she had cherished. She remembered his descriptions of the fields of poppies, the blooming hedgerows, the gardens he had seen in ruined villages. Could it be? Could those descriptions have contained hidden messages? Messages she had missed, messages meant only for her? Do you know the key? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you know which flowers represented which letters? Harding shook his head.
No.
He never told us.
He said.
He said only you would understand.
He said.
He said it was something you shared. A secret language. Of love. Lillian felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope and despair. Nathaniel had left her a clue, a message hidden in plain sight. But how could she decipher it? How could she unlock the secret code? She needed to find the letters and look again. The answer, he had said, was within. Chapter 7. The Embassy Ball Deception. The revelation of the code, the possibility of hidden messages in Nathaniel's letters, consumed Lillian. She excused herself from Captain Harding, pleading a sudden headache, the need for fresh air. He looked at her with concern, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, but he didn't try to stop her. She made her way through the crowded ballroom, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She needed to get home, to retrieve the letters, to decipher the code. But she knew she couldn't simply leave. She had to maintain the facade, to avoid arousing suspicion. As she reached the edge of the dance floor, she saw General Davies, standing near the orchestra, talking to a group of men in dark suits. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a stern face and piercing eyes. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. He nodded slightly, a cold, calculating smile playing on his lips. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. She knew, instinctively, that he was dangerous, that he was involved in the conspiracy, that he was one of them. She forced a smile, her heart hammering against her ribs. General Davies, she said, her voice steady, despite her fear. A pleasure to see you. Mrs. Wright, he replied, his voice smooth, his gaze unwavering. You look troubled. Is everything all right? Just a touch of a headache, General, she said, her voice light. The noise, the crowds. It can be a bit overwhelming. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Indeed, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But you mustn't let it spoil your evening. This is a celebration, a time for joy, for new beginnings. He paused, then added, his voice lower, and for forgetting the past. Lillian felt a surge of anger, a defiance that rose within her. Some things, General, she said, her voice firm, are not so easily forgotten. His smile widened, a cold, predatory glint in his eyes. Perhaps, he said, his voice soft. But it is often wiser to let go.
To move on.
To accept the inevitable. He was threatening her, she knew. He was warning her to stay silent, to abandon her search for the truth. But she wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't be silenced. I believe in truth, General, she said, her voice unwavering. And I believe in justice. And I will not rest until I find both. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. He took a step towards her, his hand instinctively moving towards his jacket pocket. But before he could say or do anything, a voice interrupted them. General Davies, Mrs. Wright, may I have the pleasure of this dance? It was Ambassador Beaumont, the French ambassador, a charming, silver-haired man with a twinkle in his eye. He offered Lillian his arm, his gaze shifting between her and General Davies, a subtle warning in his expression. Lillian gratefully accepted his offer, her heart still pounding. She allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor, the orchestra striking up a lively waltz. Thank you, Ambassador, she said, her voice low. You rescued me. He smiled, his eyes twinkling. I sensed you were in need of a distraction, Mrs. Wright. General Davies can be a rather intense individual. He's dangerous, Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's involved in something terrible. The ambassador's smile faded slightly. I know, he said, his voice serious. Washington is a city of secrets, Mrs. Wright. And General Davies is a master of them. But I need your help, Lillian said, her voice urgent. I need to find out what happened to a friend of mine. A Major Nathaniel Blackwood. He was working undercover. For military intelligence. He disappeared, and I believe General Davies knows something about it. The ambassador looked at her, his expression grave. Major Blackwood, I have heard whispers. He was a remarkable man. A patriot. But he was also playing a dangerous game. I know, Lillian said, her voice trembling. But he's alive. I received a letter from him. He's in hiding and I need to find him. The ambassador hesitated, then nodded slowly. I will help you, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice low. But you must be careful. General Davies is not a man to be trifled with. He has powerful allies and he will stop at nothing to protect his secrets. He paused, then added, his voice conspiratorial. There's a gathering tomorrow night. At a private residence. In Georgetown. It is a meeting of certain individuals. Individuals who may know something about Major Blackwood. I can arrange for you to be there, but you must be discreet. You must not reveal your true purpose. Lillian's heart leaped with hope. This was it. This was her chance. A chance to infiltrate the enemy's inner circle, to gather information, to find a way to reach Nathaniel. I understand, she said, her voice firm. I will be careful. And I will be grateful for any help you can give me. The ambassador smiled, his eyes twinkling. Then let us dance, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice light. And let us hope that this deception leads us to the truth. As they swirled around the floor, she felt a new surge of hope. She knew the risks, but she could not give up now, not when she was this close. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. The following day was a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Lillian spent the morning poring over Nathaniel's letters, searching for the hidden code, the secret language of flowers. She had gathered every letter, every postcard, every scrap of paper he had sent her, spreading them out on the writing desk in the library. She remembered his descriptions of the French countryside, the fields of poppies, the blooming hedgerows, the gardens he had seen in ruined villages. He had always had a way with words, a poet's eye for detail, a lover's heart for beauty. But now, she saw those descriptions in a new light. They were not just words, not just memories, they were clues, a message hidden in plain sight. She started with the first letter, the one he had sent from training camp before he had been deployed to France. He had written about the wildflowers growing near the barracks, the daisies, the buttercups, the bluebells. Daisies, she thought.
Des buttercups.
B. Bluebells. B. That couldn't be right. It was too simple, too obvious. She moved on to the next letter, the one he had sent from the front lines. He had described the poppies blooming in no man's land, their red petals stained with the blood of fallen soldiers. Poppies. P. That seemed more likely. Poppies were a symbol of remembrance, of sacrifice, of death. It fit the context, the hidden message. She continued to work her way through the letters, painstakingly noting each flower he had mentioned, trying to decipher the code, to find a pattern, a sequence of letters that made sense. It was slow, tedious work, but she was driven by a sense of urgency, a desperate need to unlock the secrets hidden within the letters. She knew that time was running out, that General Davies and his allies were closing in, that she had to find Nathaniel before they did. As the afternoon wore on, she began to see a pattern emerge. The flowers he had mentioned most frequently were poppies, roses, lilies, violets, and sunflowers. Poppies. P. Roses.
R. Lilies. L. Violet. V. Sunflowers.
S. PRLVS. It didn't make sense. It was just a jumble of letters. She was about to give up, to despair of ever deciphering the code, when she remembered something Nathaniel had once told her. He had said that the code was based on something they shared, a secret language of love. And then it hit her. The Victorian language of flowers. The secret meanings, the hidden messages conveyed by different blooms. It was something they had both been fascinated by, something they had often discussed, something they had used to communicate their feelings for each other, even before the war. She rushed to the bookshelf, pulling out a small, leather-bound volume on the language of flowers. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling. She found the entries for the flowers Nathaniel had mentioned. Poppy red, consolation. Rose red, love. Lily white, purity. Violet blue, faithfulness. Sunflower, adoration. Consolation, love. Purity, faithfulness, adoration. She rearranged the letters, following the order of the flowers in his most recent letters, the ones he had sent from the Argonne forest.
Love Press Preservation? No.
She tried again. Love RPS, love residential resist.
Protect.
Survive. Suddenly the jumble became clear. The word order was deliberately obscured. She moved the letters again.
Survive.
PROTECT, protect. RESIST, resist. The code was not one word. It was 3. A message, a plea, a command. Survive.
Protect.
Resist. It was a message to her, a warning, a guide. He was telling her to survive, to protect herself, to resist the forces that were trying to silence him, to destroy them. She was to meet with the ambassador. It was a dangerous risk, but he would know where the meeting and who they were. She just needed to be careful. She changed in a somber dark gray dress and waited. Chapter 9. A Rendezvous in the Rain. The rain began as a soft drizzle, a fine mist that blurred the streetlights and cast a hazy glow over the city. By the time Lillian's hired car arrived at the designated address, a discreet townhouse in Georgetown, it had turned into a steady downpour, the raindrops drumming against the roof of the car, the streets slick and glistening. The house was dark, unassuming, its facade blending seamlessly with the neighboring residences. There were no lights visible, no signs of activity, no indication that it was the site of a clandestine meeting. Lillian hesitated, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She was stepping into the unknown, into the heart of the enemy's territory. She had no idea who would be there, what they would say, what they would do. But she had come too far to turn back. She had deciphered Nathaniel's code. She had received the ambassador's invitation. She had steeled her resolve. She had to see this through, for Nathaniel, for herself, for the truth. She paid the driver, her hand trembling slightly, and stepped out into the rain. The cold, wet air enveloped her, sending a shiver down her spine. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her eyes scanning the street, searching for any sign of danger, any hint of surveillance. The street was deserted, the only sound the steady drumming of the rain, the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. She walked quickly to the front door of the townhouse, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. She hesitated again, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of Nathaniel's message. Survive.
Protect.
Resist. She pressed the doorbell, the sound a sharp, jarring note in the silence. She waited, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the door. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened, revealing a dimly lit hallway, a figure silhouetted against the faint light. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in shadow. "Mrs. Wright?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "Yes," Lillian replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Please, come in. The ambassador is expecting you." Lillian stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and damp wool. The man led her down the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, the man knocking softly, 3 times. A voice from inside responded, "Enter." The man opened the door, revealing a large, wood-paneled room, lit by a single, low-hanging chandelier. The room was filled with men, perhaps a dozen or so, all dressed in dark suits, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. Lillian recognized some of them, General Davies, Captain Harding, a few other men she had seen at the embassy ball, at other social gatherings. But there were also faces she didn't recognize, men with hard eyes and stern expressions, men who looked like they belonged in the shadows. And there, at the head of a long, mahogany table, sat Ambassador Beaumont, his face grave, his eyes fixed on Lillian. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice calm, his gaze unwavering. "Welcome. We've been expecting you." Lillian felt a wave of unease wash over her. This was not what she had expected. She had anticipated a discreet meeting, a chance to gather information, to observe, to listen. But this felt like a trap. "Ambassador," she said, her voice steady, her eyes scanning the room. "I was told this was a private gathering." Beaumont smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Indeed, it is, Mrs. Wright. A very private gathering. A gathering of concerned citizens. Citizens who are, shall we say, interested in your recent activities." Lillian's heart sank. They knew. They knew about the letter, about the code, about her search for Nathaniel. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice defiant, but her heart pounding with fear. Beaumont gestured to a chair at the opposite end of the table. "Please, Mrs. Wright.
Sit down.
Let us discuss the matter openly." Lillian hesitated, then slowly walked to the chair and sat down. She felt the eyes of every man in the room fixed on her, scrutinizing her, judging her, threatening her. General Davies stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have been interfering, Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice harsh. "You have been asking questions, digging into matters that are none of your concern." "I have a right to know the truth," Lillian said, her voice trembling, but her gaze unwavering. "I have a right to know what happened to Major Blackwood." Davies slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Major Blackwood is dead, Mrs. Wright. He died a hero's death, serving his country. And you will not dishonor his memory by spreading lies, by stirring up trouble." "He's not dead," Lillian said, her voice rising. "He sent me a letter."
He's alive, and you know it."
A murmur went through the room, the men exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from surprise to anger. Captain Harding stood up, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "Lillian," he said, his voice pleading.
"Please.
Don't do this. It's not worth it." "It is worth it, James," Lillian said, her voice firm. "It's worth everything. It's about truth, about justice, about love." She turned back to General Davies, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I know you're hiding something," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know you're involved in a conspiracy. And I will not rest until I expose you, until I bring you to justice." Davies stared at her, his eyes filled with hatred. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the gasp of surprise, the shuffling of feet, the rain pounding on the roof. She knew that she may have mere moments. Chapter 10. The Spy Among Us. The sudden darkness was disorienting, absolute. Lillian gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The abrupt silence, broken only by the rain and the muffled sounds of movement in the room, was more terrifying than any threat General Davies could have uttered. She instinctively pushed back her chair, her hands outstretched, trying to orient herself in the pitch black. She could hear the scraping of chairs, muttered curses, the rustling of clothing as the men in the room fumbled in the darkness. "What happened?" Someone shouted, his voice laced with panic. "The lights. Get the lights back on." Another voice commanded, closer to Lillian, recognizable as General Davies. Lillian used the chaos to her advantage. She knew she had to escape, to get out of the house before the lights came back on. She had no idea what they planned to do to her, but she knew it wouldn't be good. She crawled along the floor, her hands feeling for the wall, trying to remember the layout of the room, the location of the door. She bumped into something, a chair leg, and stifled a cry of pain. "Who's there?" A voice demanded, sharp and suspicious. It was Harding. Lillian froze, holding her breath, praying he wouldn't find her. She heard him moving closer, his footsteps heavy on the carpet. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm, its grip strong and insistent. Lillian stifled a scream, her heart pounding in her chest. She struggled, trying to break free, but the grip tightened. "Lillian, it's me," a voice whispered, close to her ear. It was a familiar voice, a voice she thought she would never hear again. "Nathaniel." She went limp, her body flooded with relief, with disbelief, with a surge of overwhelming joy. He was alive. He was here.
"Nathaniel?"
She whispered back, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" "Yes," he whispered, his voice urgent. "We have to get out of here."
"Now."
He pulled her to her feet, his hand still gripping her arm. He seemed to know the layout of the room, even in the darkness. He guided her through the maze of chairs and tables, towards the door. How did you know? Lillian whispered, her voice breathless. The ambassador, he replied, his voice low. He contacted me. He told me you were in danger. They reached the door, Nathaniel fumbling for the handle. He opened it, a crack of faint light appearing from the hallway. Stay close to me, he whispered, his voice urgent. And don't make a sound. They slipped out into the hallway, the sounds of confusion and anger still echoing from the room behind them. Nathaniel closed the door softly, his hand still gripping Lillian's arm. He led her down the hallway, towards the front door. They could hear voices approaching, the heavy footsteps of men searching for them. We have to hurry, Nathaniel whispered, his voice strained. They'll be coming this way. They reached the front door, Nathaniel fumbling with the lock. He opened it, the cold, wet air rushing in, the sound of the rain a welcome relief from the suffocating tension of the house. They stepped out into the night, the rain washing over them, cleansing them, freeing them. Nathaniel pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Lillian, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd lost you. I thought I'd lost you too, she replied, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. They stood there for a moment, locked in each other's embrace, the rain pouring down around them, the world outside fading away. It was a moment of reunion, of relief, of rekindled love. But the danger wasn't over. They were still being hunted. They had to escape, to find a safe place, to figure out what to do next. We have to go, Nathaniel said, his voice urgent. They'll be looking for us. He led her away from the house, down the dark, rain-soaked street, towards the unknown. He looked behind, to see that no one had managed to follow. There is a safe house not far. The ambassador arranged it. He didn't release her. Chapter 11. Letters from the Front. Revisited. The safe house was a small, unassuming apartment above a bakery, the air filled with the warm, comforting scent of yeast and sugar. It was sparsely furnished, but clean and dry, a welcome refuge from the storm raging outside, both literally and figuratively. Nathaniel lit a kerosene lamp, the soft glow illuminating the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He bolted the door, his movements quick and efficient, his eyes constantly scanning the windows, checking for any sign of pursuit. Lillian watched him, her heart still pounding, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. He looked different, older, wearier, his face etched with the lines of hardship and stress. But his eyes, those deep blue eyes that she had fallen in love with, still held the same warmth, the same intensity, the same unwavering love for her. Are you all right? He asked, his voice filled with concern. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers gently wiping away the raindrops that still clung to her skin. I am now, she replied, her voice trembling. But how did you get there? How did you know I was in danger? He explained about Ambassador Beaumont, the secret message, the desperate gamble to reach her in time. He told her about his life in hiding, the constant fear of discovery, the network of contacts who had helped him, protected him.
But why?
Lillian asked, her voice filled with confusion. Why did they fake your death? Why are they trying to silence you? Nathaniel sighed, his expression grave. It's a long story, he said, his voice low. And a complicated one. It involves a conspiracy. A plot to manipulate the peace negotiations, to control the outcome of the war for their own gain. He explained about the Society of Shadows, the secret organization of powerful men who had orchestrated the war, who had profited from it, who were now trying to shape the peace to their own advantage. He told her about his role as an undercover agent, gathering intelligence on both sides, trying to expose their plans, to bring them to justice. But they found out, he said, his voice bitter. They discovered my true identity. They tried to kill me, but I escaped. I had to disappear to protect myself, and to protect you. But the letter, Lillian said, her voice urgent. The one you sent me, how did you manage that? He smiled, a faint, weary smile. Anya, he said, his voice soft.
She helped me.
She risked her life to get that letter to you. Anya, Lillian repeated, the name stirring a memory. The woman in the locket. Captain Harding told me about her. He said she was a courier, that she disappeared too. Nathaniel nodded, his expression somber. She's still missing, he said, his voice heavy. I don't know what happened to her. I fear the worst. Lillian felt a surge of sadness, of empathy for the woman she had never met, the woman who had shared Nathaniel's dangerous life, who had risked everything for him. We have to find her, Lillian said, her voice firm. We have to find out what happened to her. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration, with gratitude, with love. I know, he said, his voice soft.
And we will.
Together. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. This is my journal, he said, his voice hesitant. It contains everything. The names, the dates, the details of the conspiracy. It's the evidence we need to expose them. Lillian took the notebook, her fingers tracing the faded leather cover. But it's dangerous, she said, her voice worried. If they find it, they won't, Nathaniel said, his voice firm. I'll protect it. And I'll protect you. He paused, then added, his voice softer. There's something else. Something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his expression filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The code, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The one I used in my letters. It wasn't just about survival, protection, resistance. It was also a declaration. A message of love. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. She remembered the flowers, the Victorian language, the hidden meanings. Consolation.
Love. Purity.
Faithfulness. Adoration. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I deciphered it. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes, that made her heart ache with longing. But there's more, he said, his voice low. There's another layer. Another message hidden within the message. He opened a drawer and brought out her letters. He wanted to show her. Chapter 12. The Widow's Gambit. Nathaniel spread Lillian's letters across the small table, the faded paper illuminated by the flickering lamplight. They were the letters she had sent him during the war, filled with news of home, of Washington society, of her longing for him, her fears for his safety. He had carried them with him, a tangible link to her, a source of strength and comfort in the darkness of the trenches. Look closely, he said, his voice soft, his finger tracing the lines of her elegant handwriting. Not at the words themselves, but at the structure. The way you arranged the sentences. The punctuation. Lillian looked at the letters, her eyes scanning the familiar words, the familiar phrases. She had written them with such care, such love, pouring her heart out to him, sharing her innermost thoughts and feelings. But now, she saw them in a new light. She noticed the subtle variations in the length of the sentences, the placement of the commas, the use of dashes and semicolons. It was a pattern, a rhythm, a code hidden within the prose. It's Morse code, she said, her voice filled with realization. You used Morse code in your letters, and I unconsciously mirrored it in mine. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes shining with admiration. You always were a quick study, he said, his voice filled with affection. And you always had a natural talent for languages. Even the unspoken ones. He explained how he had used the dots and dashes of Morse code to spell out short messages, hidden within the seemingly innocuous descriptions of the weather, the landscape, the daily life of a soldier. And she, in her responses, had unknowingly echoed those patterns, creating a reciprocal code, a secret conversation that had flowed between them, across the miles, across the battlefield. He pointed to a specific passage in one of her letters, a description of a garden she had visited, a garden filled with roses and lilies and violets. See here, he said, his finger tracing the words. The way you describe the arrangement of the flowers, the long rows of roses, the short clusters of lilies, the scattered violets, it's a message. He translated the pattern of long and short sentences, the placement of the commas and semicolons, into dots and dashes, and then into letters.
Anya is alive and well.
Lillian's heart leaped with joy, with relief, with a surge of renewed hope. Anya was alive. She was safe. She was the key to unraveling the conspiracy, to exposing the Society of Shadows.
But where?
Lillian asked, her voice urgent. Where is she? Nathaniel pointed to another passage. In a different letter, a description of a concert she had attended, a performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Here, he said, his finger tracing the words. The way you described the movements of the symphony, the allegro con brio, the andante con moto, the scherzo, the allegro, it's a location. He translated the musical terms, the Italian phrases, into a series of coordinates, a latitude and longitude. It's an address, he said, his voice filled with excitement. A place in Paris. Near the Luxembourg Gardens.
Paris.
Anya was in Paris. They had a location, a lead, a chance to find her, to bring her back, to finally expose the truth. But Lillian knew that they couldn't simply go to Paris. They were being hunted, pursued by General Davies and his allies. They needed a plan, a strategy, a way to outwit their enemies, to turn the tables on them. And then it came to her, an idea, a daring gambit, a risky maneuver that could either save them or destroy them. I have a plan, she said, her voice firm, her eyes shining with determination. But it will require a performance, a deception on a grand scale. She explained her plan to Nathaniel, outlining the steps, the risks, the potential rewards. It involved using her social connections, her position as a respected widow, to manipulate the players, to set a trap for General Davies and his cohorts. It was a dangerous game, a high-stakes gamble, but she was willing to risk everything to protect Nathaniel, to find Anya, to bring the truth to light. It's brilliant, Nathaniel said, his voice filled with admiration. But it's also incredibly dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this? Lillian looked at him, her eyes filled with love, with resolve, with a fierce determination that burned brighter than any fear. I'm sure, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm a widow. They will think me harmless. I will be the one to find Anya. It is time I used their presumptions against them. He nodded slowly. She was right. She was the only one who could. Chapter 13. Trapped in Plain Sight. Lillian's plan, the widow's gambit as she had christened it, hinged on a carefully orchestrated series of social engagements, each designed to subtly manipulate the key players in the conspiracy, to draw them out, to expose their weaknesses, to set the stage for their downfall. She started with Eleanor Harding. She invited her to tea, a seemingly innocent gesture, a chance to reconnect with her old friend. But Lillian had a hidden agenda. She needed information, insights into Captain Harding's activities, his connections to General Davies, his role in the Society of Shadows. She chose the morning room, the sunlit space where she had first read Nathaniel's letter, the room that felt most like her own, a place of comfort and familiarity. She arranged the tea service herself, the delicate china cups, the silver spoons, the plate of freshly baked scones, a picture of domestic tranquility designed to lull Eleanor into a false sense of security. Eleanor arrived promptly, dressed in a stylish afternoon dress, her usual cheerful demeanor slightly subdued, her eyes shadowed with a hint of worry. Lillian, darling, you look different, Eleanor said, her brow furrowed with concern. Are you feeling all right? You've been so withdrawn lately. Lillian forced a smile, her heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. Just a bit tired, Eleanor, she said, her voice light. The anniversary, you know. It always takes its toll. She steered the conversation towards innocuous topics, the latest gossip, the upcoming social events, the ongoing political debates. But gradually, subtly, she began to probe, to ask questions, to plant seeds of doubt. I saw James at the embassy ball, she said, casually as she poured the tea. He seemed preoccupied.
Distracted.
Is everything all right with him? Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. He's been working long hours, she said, her voice evasive. The war, you know. It's left its mark on everyone. Of course, Lillian said, her voice sympathetic.
But I worry about him.
He seems different.
Changed.
She paused, then added, her voice lower. He mentioned secrets. Things that are best left buried. Do you know what he meant? Eleanor's face paled slightly. She took a sip of her tea, her hand trembling. I don't know, she said, her voice strained. James, he doesn't talk much about his work. He keeps things close to his chest. Lillian pressed further, gently, subtly, using her knowledge of Eleanor's vulnerabilities, her insecurities, her loyalty to her husband. But surely, you must have some idea, she said, her voice soft. You're his wife. You share his life. You know his secrets. Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. There are things, Lillian, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things I don't understand. Things that frighten me. She confessed her suspicions, her doubts, her growing fear that her husband was involved in something dangerous, something illegal, something that could destroy them both. Lillian listened patiently, offering words of comfort, of support, of understanding. But she also gathered information, piecing together the puzzle, confirming her suspicions, strengthening her resolve. By the time Eleanor left, Lillian had learned a crucial piece of information. Captain Harding was scheduled to meet with General Davies the following evening at a private club downtown, a place known for its discreet clientele, its clandestine meetings. It was a breakthrough, a chance to observe them, to gather evidence, to set the next stage of her plan in motion. But it was also a risk, a dangerous gamble. She was stepping into the lion's den, placing herself in harm's way. She needed to be perfect, to betray nothing. She spent the rest of the day preparing, rehearsing her lines, perfecting her demeanor, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. She was the grieving widow, the vulnerable socialite, the unsuspecting pawn. She was trapped in plain sight, but she would use that to her advantage, she had told Nathaniel. And she would. She knew she was also a woman in love, willing to do anything. Chapter 14. The Truth Behind the Medals. The private club, known as the Griffin, was a dimly lit, wood-paneled establishment, tucked away on a quiet side street in downtown Washington. It was a place of hushed conversations, clandestine deals, and unspoken secrets. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke, expensive whiskey, and the subtle undercurrent of power and intrigue. Lillian, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, a veiled hat casting a shadow over her face, arrived shortly after nightfall. She had secured an invitation through a distant relative, a man of influence who frequented the club, a man who owed her a favor. She had presented herself as a grieving widow, seeking solace in the company of her late husband's acquaintances, a plausible excuse that would allow her to move freely, to observe, to listen. She entered the club, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The main room was sparsely populated, a few men scattered at tables, engaged in quiet conversations, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of table lamps. She recognized some of them, politicians, lobbyists, military officials, the usual denizens of Washington's shadowy underworld. She took a seat at a small table near the back, a strategic location that offered a clear view of the entrance, the bar, and the private rooms where the more discreet meetings took place. She ordered a glass of sherry, a prop to maintain her cover, a way to blend in with the surroundings. She waited, her eyes scanning the room, searching for Captain Harding, for General Davies. She sipped her sherry, her hand trembling slightly, her mind racing, replaying her plan, anticipating every possible scenario. After what seemed like an eternity, Captain Harding arrived. He looked tense, his eyes darting around the room, his hand instinctively touching his jacket pocket, as if checking for something. He scanned the room, saw Lillian sitting at the table, and walked toward her. Mrs. Wright, he began, what a surprise. She rose slightly.
Captain, please.
Join me. She took control before he could do anything. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and took the seat across from her, as she had planned. They made small talk. She asked about Eleanor. She asked if the War Department had any further news regarding fallen soldiers. That was where she would begin.
Captain, she said, softly.
I have such admiration for our soldiers. The medals they receive, they must represent so much pain, such sacrifice. He looked at her, and she detected the slightest flicker of fear. Indeed, Mrs. Wright, it is a burden, but one we carry with honor. Of course, Captain. But tell me, are all medals earned honorably? He choked slightly on his drink. Of course. Even those received by Major Blackwood? She watched him closely. He paled. He died a hero. Did he, Captain? Or did you give him those medals to cover a lie? He was silent, then whispered. You know too much. I know everything, Captain. I know about the Society of Shadows. I know about General Davies. I know about the plot to manipulate the peace negotiations. And I know that Nathaniel is alive. He looked defeated. He contacted you?
He did.
And he told me everything, including the location of Anya. Harding's eyes widened in disbelief.
Anya?
She's alive?
She is.
And she's the key to exposing all of you. Lillian saw General Davies enter the club. He looked around, spotted Harding, and started walking towards them, a predatory gleam in his eyes. It was time. Lillian stood up, her voice clear and strong, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. General Davies, she said, her voice ringing with authority. I believe you have something to tell us. Something about a conspiracy. Something about a murdered soldier. Something about a woman named Anya. Davies stopped dead in his tracks, his face a mask of shock and fury. He looked at Harding, his eyes filled with betrayal. You told her, he snarled, his voice low and menacing. I told her the truth, Harding replied, his voice surprisingly firm. And now, it's time for you to do the same. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Davies, on Harding, on Lillian. The truth, so long hidden, was about to be revealed. The medals, so proudly displayed, were about to lose their luster. And Lillian, the grieving widow, the unsuspecting pawn, was about to become the instrument of justice. She raised her voice. Tell them, General. Tell them what really happened. Chapter 15. A promise broken. A promise kept. General Davies stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, rage, fear, disbelief. The silence in the club was absolute, broken only by the clinking of ice in a glass, the distant murmur of traffic outside. Every eye was on him, waiting, expectant. You have no proof, Davies finally spat, his voice low and dangerous. No evidence. It's your word against mine, Mrs. Wright. A grieving widow, easily manipulated, prone to fantasies. Lillian met his gaze, unflinching. I have more than my word, General. I have Nathaniel's journal. I have his letters. I have the code. And I have Captain Harding, a witness who is finally willing to tell the truth. Harding stood up, his face pale but resolute. He's lying, he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the room. Major Blackwood was not killed in action. He was working undercover, investigating the Society of Shadows. They discovered his true identity and tried to eliminate him. The telegram, it was all a fabrication, a cover-up. A murmur went through the room, a wave of shock and disbelief rippling through the assembled men. Davies glared at Harding, his eyes filled with venom. You traitor, he hissed. You'll pay for this. I'm already paying for it, General, Harding replied, his voice tinged with regret. I've been living a lie for 2 years. I've been complicit in your crimes. But I'm done. I'm finished with the secrets, the lies, the betrayals. He turned to Lillian, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice sincere. You gave me the courage to do what I should have done a long time ago. Lillian nodded, her heart filled with a mix of relief and sadness. She had broken a man, but she had also freed him. She had used his loyalty, his guilt, his love for Eleanor, to expose the truth. Tell them, General, Lillian repeated, her voice unwavering. Tell them about Anya. Tell them where she is. Davies hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, assessing his options. He was trapped, cornered, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. He knew he had lost. Anya, he began, his voice faltering. She was a courier. She carried messages between Blackwood and his contacts. She knew too much. She was a liability. And what did you do with her? Lillian pressed, her voice relentless. She was taken care of, Davies said, his voice evasive. Removed from the equation. Murdered? Lillian challenged, her voice sharp. Davies didn't answer. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. She's alive, General, Lillian said, her voice filled with conviction. Nathaniel found her. She's in Paris. And she's waiting to testify against you. It was a bluff, a calculated risk. She didn't know for sure that Anya was in Paris, that Nathaniel had found her. But she needed to break Davies, to force him to confess, to reveal the full extent of his crimes. The bluff worked. Davies' face crumbled. He looked up at Lillian, his eyes filled with despair. Paris, he whispered. How did you know? It doesn't matter, Lillian said, her voice cold. What matters is that you're finished. Your conspiracy is exposed. Your crimes will be punished. She turned to the assembled men, her voice ringing with authority. This man, she said, pointing to Davies, is a traitor. He has betrayed his country, his uniform, his oath. He has manipulated the war for his own gain. He has murdered innocent people. He deserves to be brought to justice. A murmur of agreement went through the room. The men who had once been Davies' allies, his accomplices, now turned against him, their faces filled with disgust, with anger, with fear. Suddenly, the doors of the club burst open, and a group of men in military police uniforms stormed in, their weapons drawn. They were led by Ambassador Beaumont, his face grim, his eyes determined. General Davies, Beaumont said, his voice commanding. You are under arrest. For treason, conspiracy, and murder. The military police surrounded Davies, their hands on their weapons. He didn't resist. He stood there, defeated, his head bowed, his dreams of power and wealth shattered. As they led Davies away, Lillian felt a wave of exhaustion, of relief, of sadness. The battle was over. The truth had been revealed.
But the cost had been high.
She had broken a promise to herself, a promise to remain in the shadows, to live a quiet, peaceful life. But she had kept a promise to Nathaniel, a promise to find him, to protect him, to bring his enemies to justice. She hoped Anya was all right, but she felt Nathaniel with her. She looked at Harding, who was being questioned by the military police. He would face his own reckoning, his own punishment. But he had also found redemption, a chance to atone for his sins. Lillian turned and walked out of the club, leaving behind the darkness, the secrets, the betrayals. She stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmering around her. The war was over. But the fight for justice had just begun. She glanced at her watch. She needed to send a message to Nathaniel. Chapter 16. The Enemy Within. The message Lillian sent to Nathaniel was brief, coded, and urgent. Griffin secured. Davies arrested. Anya location confirmed.
Paris.
Proceed with caution. Enemy within. She sent it through a trusted intermediary, a contact of Ambassador Beaumont's, a man who operated in the shadowy world of espionage and counterintelligence. She knew the message would reach Nathaniel, but she also knew that it wouldn't be enough. She had exposed General Davies and the Society of Shadows, but she knew that the conspiracy ran deeper, that there were other players, other forces at work. The phrase enemy within had been nagging at her since her conversation with Nathaniel in the safe house. He had mentioned it almost in passing, a cryptic warning that had lingered in her mind. Who was the enemy within? Was it someone in the French government? Someone in the American delegation? Someone closer to home? She returned to the Georgetown townhouse, the house that had once been a sanctuary, a refuge, but now felt like a cage, a place of shadows and secrets. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen enemies. Mrs. Davis greeted her at the door, her face etched with worry. "Mrs. Wright, are you all right? You look pale. And there have been visitors." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. Visitors? Who? Two gentlemen. From the War Department. They said they were investigating General Davies. They asked questions. About you. About Major Blackwood. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. The War Department. They were closing in. They knew about her involvement, her connection to Nathaniel. What did they look like? Lillian asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Davis described them. Tall, stern-faced men in dark suits, their eyes cold and calculating. They didn't give their names, but they showed official identification, badges that confirmed their authority. They said they would be back, Mrs. Davis said, her voice filled with apprehension. They said it was a matter of national security. Lillian knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't stay in the house. She couldn't risk being captured, interrogated, silenced. She had to disappear, to go underground, to find a way to reach Nathaniel, to warn him. She went to the library, to the cedar-lined box, and retrieved Nathaniel's journal, the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. She wrapped it in oilcloth, a waterproof protection against the elements, and tucked it into a small satchel, along with a few essential belongings. She changed into a simple, dark dress, a coat, and a hat that would conceal her features. She looked around the room at the familiar objects, the books, the furniture, the photographs, the memories of her life, a life that was now shattered, irrevocably changed. She wrote a brief note to Mrs. Davis, thanking her for her loyalty, her service, her kindness. She left her a substantial sum of money, enough to ensure her security, her well-being. She slipped out of the house, unnoticed, unseen, disappearing into the night, into the labyrinthine streets of Washington. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver an address on the other side of the city, a place where she could blend in, disappear, become anonymous. She knew she was being followed. She could sense it, the subtle surveillance, the unmarked cars trailing her, the eyes watching her every move. She had to be careful, to be elusive, to shake off her pursuers. She changed taxis several times, weaving through the city, using her knowledge of the back alleys, the side streets, the hidden passages. She paid the drivers in cash, leaving no trace, no record of her movements. Finally, she reached her destination, Union Station, the grand, bustling railway station that served as the gateway to the nation. It was a place of anonymity, of constant movement, of endless possibilities. She bought a ticket to New York, a destination that would throw her pursuers off her trail, a place where she could connect with another contact, a person who could help her reach Paris, reach Nathaniel. She boarded the train, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She found a seat in a crowded carriage, surrounded by strangers, their faces blurred, their conversations a muffled hum. She looked out the window, at the receding lights of Washington, the city that had been her home, her prison, her battlefield. She was leaving it all behind, the life she had known, the security she had craved, the illusions she had clung to. She was entering a new world, a world of danger, of uncertainty, of relentless pursuit. But she was also entering a world of hope, of love, of unwavering determination. She had to reach Nathaniel. She had to warn him. She had to expose the enemy within. She had to finish what she had started. She clutched the satchel, with the precious journal inside, her link to his survival, and hers. Chapter 17. Escape from Washington. The train rattled northward, a steel serpent winding its way through the darkness, carrying Lillian further and further away from Washington, from the clutches of her pursuers. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the swaying motion of the carriage, the muffled conversations of her fellow passengers created a strange sense of detachment, of unreality. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of dark shapes, fleeting lights, and shadowy silhouettes. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed, even within the relative anonymity of the crowded train. She had chosen a seat in the middle of the carriage, a strategic location that offered a clear view of both ends, of anyone approaching, anyone leaving. She kept her satchel clutched tightly in her lap, her hand resting on the oilcloth-wrapped journal, the evidence that could expose the conspiracy, the key to Nathaniel's survival, and her own. She tried to blend in, to appear as an ordinary traveler, a woman alone, heading north for some mundane reason. She had removed her hat, allowing her hair to fall loosely around her shoulders, a subtle change in appearance that might help her evade recognition. She observed her fellow passengers, searching for any sign of suspicion, any hint of surveillance. There was a young couple, lost in their own world, their hands intertwined, their heads close together. There was an elderly woman, knitting furiously, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. There was a businessman, engrossed in a newspaper, his face obscured by the broadsheet. And then there was him, a man sitting a few rows ahead, on the opposite side of the aisle. He was tall, well-built, with dark hair and a stern face. He was dressed in a nondescript suit, a gray overcoat, a fedora pulled low over his eyes. He seemed to be reading a book, but Lillian noticed that his eyes kept darting around the carriage, scanning the faces, lingering on her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She felt a chill run down her spine.
He was one of them.
He was following her. She had to be careful, to be subtle, to avoid arousing his suspicion. She couldn't risk a confrontation, not on the train, not in such a confined space. She had to find a way to escape, to slip away unnoticed. She waited for the next stop, a small town in Maryland, a brief pause in the train's relentless journey north. As the train slowed, she gathered her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate, trying to appear calm, unhurried. The train came to a halt, the doors hissing open, the platform bustling with activity. People getting on, people getting off, a brief flurry of movement, a chance to disappear in the crowd. Lillian stood up, her satchel clutched tightly in her hand. She made her way towards the exit, her eyes scanning the platform, searching for an escape route. The man in the fedora stood up too, his movements mirroring hers. He started to follow her, his eyes fixed on her back. Lillian quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the exit, stepping out onto the platform, the cold night air hitting her face. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She blended into the crowd, moving quickly, purposefully, towards the edge of the platform, towards the darkness beyond. She found a small, deserted alleyway, a narrow passage between two buildings, a hidden escape route. She slipped into the alleyway, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth, the shadows concealing her from view. She heard the train whistle blow, the doors hissing closed, the wheels starting to turn. The train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, leaving her behind, alone in the darkness. She had escaped.
For now.
But she knew that the pursuit wouldn't end there. They would be looking for her, searching for her, hunting her down. She had to keep moving, to stay one step ahead, to find a way to reach New York, to connect with her contact, to get to Paris. She emerged from the alleyway, onto a quiet side street, the town shrouded in darkness, the only sounds the distant rumble of the departing train, the occasional bark of a dog. She needed to find transportation, a way to continue her journey, a way to disappear again. She spotted a small, all-night diner, a beacon of light in the darkness, a potential refuge, a place to gather her thoughts, to plan her next move. She needed to find a way to New York quickly, and she knew she could not risk a train. Chapter 18. The Safe House That Wasn't. The diner was a haven of warmth and light, a stark contrast to the cold, dark streets outside. The air was thick with the aroma of coffee, bacon, and frying onions, a comforting smell that momentarily eased Lillian's anxiety. A few customers were scattered at the counter and in the booths, truck drivers, late-night travelers, locals seeking refuge from the loneliness of the night. Lillian chose a booth near the back, a strategic location that offered a view of the entrance and the road outside. She ordered a cup of coffee, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the order with the waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired face and a kind smile. She needed to find transportation, a way to reach New York without using the train, without leaving a paper trail. She couldn't risk being seen, being recognized, being captured. She sipped her coffee, her mind racing, considering her options. She could try to hitchhike, but that was too risky, too unpredictable. She could try to steal a car, but that was beyond her capabilities, her moral compass. And then she remembered. A conversation she had had with Arthur years ago during the war. He had mentioned a network of safe houses used by government agents, by spies, by people who needed to disappear. He had never revealed the details, the locations, the contacts, but he had hinted at their existence. Could there be a safe house nearby? A place where she could hide, where she could find assistance, where she could continue her journey in secrecy. She decided to take a chance. She called the waitress over, her voice low and hesitant. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes scanning the diner, making sure no one was listening. "I need help. I needed to get to New York. But I can't use the train. I'm in trouble." The waitress looked at her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice cautious. Lillian hesitated, then decided to reveal a small part of the truth. "I'm being followed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. By men from the government. They want something I have. Something important." The waitress studied her for a moment, her gaze unwavering. She seemed to be assessing her credibility, her sincerity, her desperation. "Wait here," she said, finally, her voice low. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Lillian alone with her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. After what seemed like an eternity, the waitress returned, her expression unreadable. She placed a small, folded piece of paper on the table. "There's a place," she said, her voice barely audible. "About 10 miles north of here. On Route 1. A farmhouse. With a red barn. Ask for Mr. Smith." Lillian's heart leaped with hope. A safe house. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was her only chance. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've saved my life." The waitress nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Just be careful," she said, her voice warning. "Not everyone is who they seem." Lillian paid for her coffee, leaving a generous tip. She slipped out of the diner unnoticed, unseen, disappearing into the night. She found a taxi parked outside, a lone vehicle waiting for a fare. She approached the driver, a young man with a bored expression, and gave him the directions, her voice firm, her heart pounding. The ride was tense, silent, the only sound the hum of the engine, the occasional passing of another car. Lillian sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, searching for any sign of pursuit, any hint of danger. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the farmhouse. It was a large, 2-story building, set back from the road, surrounded by fields, a red barn standing prominently beside it. It looked deserted, no lights visible, no signs of activity. Lillian paid the driver, her hand trembling slightly. She stepped out of the taxi, the cold night air hitting her face. She watched as the taxi drove away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her alone, exposed, vulnerable. She approached the farmhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the front door, hesitating for a moment, her hand hovering over the knocker. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of Nathaniel's message. Survive. Protect. Resist. She knocked on the door, 3 times, the sound echoing in the silence. She waited, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the door. The door opened, revealing a man standing in the dimly lit hallway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern face and piercing eyes. He was not Mr. Smith. It was General Davies. Lillian gasped, her body frozen with shock, with terror. It was a trap. The safe house was a lie. She had been betrayed. The waitress, the taxi, it was all a very careful setup. "Welcome, Mrs. Wright," Davies said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "We've been expecting you." Chapter 19. The Final Revelation. Lillian stood frozen, her mind reeling, her body paralyzed with fear. The farmhouse, the safe house, the promise of escape, it had all been a carefully orchestrated deception, a trap designed to lure her into the clutches of her enemy. "How?" she stammered, her voice trembling, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape route, a way out of this nightmare. Davies chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound that sent shivers down her spine. You underestimate us, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you can outsmart us, outmaneuver us? You're just a grieving widow, playing a game you don't understand. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the farmhouse. Come in, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice deceptively polite. We have much to discuss. Lillian hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, to flee, to fight. But she knew it was futile. She was surrounded, outnumbered, outmatched. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She slowly stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud, sealing her fate. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The farmhouse felt cold, empty, abandoned, a stark contrast to the warm, comforting aroma of the diner, the false promise of safety. Davies led her into a large, sparsely furnished living room. A single lamp illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. There were two other men in the room, both dressed in dark suits, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They were the same men who had visited her house, the men from the War Department. You remember my associates, Mrs. Wright, Davies said, his voice smooth, his gaze unwavering. They're very interested in your activities. Your interference. Lillian stood there, silent, defiant, her eyes fixed on Davies. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her despair. She would face him with courage, with dignity, with the unwavering conviction that she was right, that she had done the right thing. Where is Nathaniel? She asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. Davies smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. Major Blackwood is no longer a concern, he said, his voice evasive. He has been dealt with. Lillian felt a surge of anger, of grief, of despair. But she refused to believe him. She had to believe that Nathaniel was still alive, that he was still fighting, that he would find a way to escape. You're lying, she said, her voice firm. You haven't killed him. You wouldn't dare. Davies laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You overestimate his importance, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice condescending.
He was just a pawn, a tool, like you.
He gestured to a chair, a hard, wooden chair that stood in the center of the room. Sit down, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice commanding. And tell us everything. Tell us about the journal. Tell us about your contacts. Tell us about your plans. Lillian hesitated, then slowly walked to the chair and sat down. She knew she had to stall, to buy time, to find a way to outwit him, to escape. I have nothing to tell you, she said, her voice defiant. I don't know anything about a journal. I don't have any contacts. I don't have any plans. Davies sighed, his expression one of mock disappointment. You disappoint me, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice smooth. I thought you were smarter than this. I thought you would cooperate. He nodded to one of the men in suits, who stepped forward, holding a small, leather-bound book. It was Nathaniel's journal. Lillian's heart sank. They had found it. They had the evidence, the proof of the conspiracy. We found this in your satchel, Mrs. Wright, Davies said, his voice triumphant. A very interesting read. A detailed account of your husband's activities. And your own. He opened the journal, flipping through the pages, reading aloud excerpts, passages that detailed Nathaniel's investigation, his discoveries, his suspicions. He read the names of the conspirators, the dates of their meetings, the details of their plans. You see, Mrs. Wright, Davies said, his voice smug. We know everything. We know about your little game. Your attempt to expose us. He closed the journal, his eyes fixed on Lillian. But it's over now, he said, his voice cold. You've failed. You're finished. He nodded to the other man in a suit, who stepped forward, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Lillian's eyes widened in horror. She knew what it was. A drug, a sedative, something that would silence her, erase her memory, destroy her mind. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please don't. Davies smiled, a cruel, heartless smile. It's for your own good, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice soothing. You'll forget everything. You'll be at peace. As the man approached her with a syringe, Lillian closed her eyes, her mind racing, searching for a way out, a final desperate act of defiance. And then she remembered. The code. Nathaniel's code. The message hidden in his letters.
Survive. Protect.
Resist. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Davies, her voice clear and strong. "You may silence me, General," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But you won't silence the truth. The truth will come out. You will be exposed. You will be punished." She paused, then added, her voice filled with a strange, eerie calm. "And Nathaniel, he will be avenged." At that moment, the farmhouse door burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the night. It was Nathaniel. He held a gun in his hand and pointed it at General Davies. He looked at Lillian, and then he fired. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The gunshot echoed through the farmhouse, shattering the tense silence, the culmination of weeks of deception, betrayal, and relentless pursuit. General Davies crumpled to the floor, the syringe falling from his hand, the clear liquid spilling onto the worn wooden planks. The two men in suits stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons they hadn't had time to draw. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and relief. He lowered the gun slightly but kept it trained on the two men, his fingers still on the trigger. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice cold and hard, the voice of a soldier, a warrior, a man who had seen too much death, too much betrayal. Lillian sat in the chair, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. She had been moments away from oblivion, from having her mind erased, her memory stolen, her voice silenced forever. And then, Nathaniel had appeared, like a ghost, like an avenging angel, saving her from a fate worse than death. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, tears streaming down her face. "You're alive, you're here." He looked at her, his eyes softening, his expression filled with a mixture of love, relief, and regret. "I told you I'd protect you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I told you I'd come for you." He turned his attention back to the two men, his gaze hardening. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" The men hesitated, their eyes darting between Nathaniel and the body of General Davies. They knew they were outmatched, outgunned, their carefully laid plan shattered, their conspiracy exposed. We work for the War Department," one of them stammered, his voice trembling. "We were investigating General Davies." We had no idea," Nathaniel scoffed, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You're lying," he said, his voice cold. "You're part of it. You're part of the Society of Shadows. You were going to silence her just like you tried to silence me." He raised the gun again, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "Or I swear, I'll wait," Lillian interrupted, her voice surprisingly strong. "Don't kill them. We need them. We need them to testify. We need them to expose the rest of the conspiracy." Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes flickering between Lillian and the two men. He knew she was right. Killing them would be an act of revenge, of justice, perhaps, but it wouldn't serve the greater purpose. It wouldn't bring down the Society of Shadows. It wouldn't bring Anya back. He slowly lowered the gun, his hand still shaking. "All right," he said, his voice grudging. "But they're coming with us. They're going to tell us everything they know." He gestured with the gun, ordering the men to their feet, their hands raised above their heads. He searched them, finding weapons, identification, documents that confirmed their connection to the War Department, to the conspiracy. He bound their hands with rope he found in a nearby closet, his movements quick and efficient, the actions of a soldier, a man trained for combat, for survival. He then turned to Lillian, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Did they hurt you?" Lillian shook her head, her body still trembling, but her spirit unbroken. "I'm fine," she said, her voice stronger now. "Thanks to you. You saved my life." He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her, guiding her. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to get out of here. Before they send reinforcements. Before they realize what's happened." They left the farmhouse, leaving behind the body of General Davies, the shattered remnants of the conspiracy, the echoes of betrayal and violence. They stepped out into the cool night air, the darkness a welcome embrace, a cloak of concealment. Nathaniel had a car hidden nearby, a nondescript vehicle he had acquired through his network of contacts. He helped Lillian into the passenger seat, his movements gentle, his eyes filled with concern. He started the engine, the sound a roar in the stillness of the night. He drove away from the farmhouse, away from the scene of the confrontation, away from the clutches of his enemies. As they drove, Lillian told him everything. She told him about the waitress, the taxi, the trap. She told him about the journal, the syringe, the near-death experience. She told him about her unwavering belief that he was still alive, her determination to find him, to expose the truth. Nathaniel listened, his face grim, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and love. He had underestimated her, he realized. He had thought of her as a grieving widow, a vulnerable socialite, a woman who needed his protection. But she was so much more. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman of courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination. She had risked everything to find him, to save him, to bring his enemies to justice. "You're amazing, Lillian," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You're the bravest woman I know." Lillian smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "We did it, Nathaniel," she said, her voice filled with relief.
We exposed them. We won.
But Nathaniel knew that it wasn't over. Not yet. There was still Anya to find, the rest of the Society of Shadows to bring down, a new life to build, a future to forge. "It's not over," he said, his voice serious. "But we're together now, and we'll face whatever comes together." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They drove on, into the night, towards an uncertain future, but a future filled with hope, with love, with the unwavering promise of a new beginning. The reckoning had happened. Now, only the future remained.
Epilogue.
The journey to Paris was a blur of hurried arrangements, clandestine meetings, and whispered conversations. Nathaniel, using his network of contacts, secured false passports, travel documents, and passage on a freighter bound for Le Havre. They traveled under assumed names, posing as a married couple, their true identities hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of anonymity. They arrived in Paris under a gray, drizzly sky, the city shrouded in a mist that mirrored the uncertainty, the apprehension that hung over them. They found a small, discreet hotel near the Luxembourg Gardens, the location Anya had been traced to, the place where they hoped to find her, to finally unravel the last threads of the conspiracy. Nathaniel contacted his sources, whispers in the Parisian underworld, men and women who operated in the shadows, who knew the secrets of the city. He learned that Anya had been working with the French resistance, helping to smuggle refugees, to gather intelligence, to disrupt the remnants of the German occupation. She had been living under an assumed name, working as a waitress in a small cafe near the Sorbonne, a place frequented by students, intellectuals, and artists. It was a dangerous life, a life of constant risk, of living on the edge. Nathaniel and Lillian found the cafe, a cozy, bustling establishment filled with the aroma of coffee, croissants, and Gaulois cigarettes. They sat at a table near the window, observing the patrons, searching for a familiar face, a hint of recognition. And then they saw her. She was serving a table near the back, her movements quick and efficient, her eyes darting around the room, ever watchful, ever alert. She looked different, older, wearier, her hair cut short, her clothes simple and unassuming. But it was her.
Anya.
Nathaniel caught her eye, a subtle nod, a silent signal. She recognized him, her eyes widening slightly, a flicker of surprise, of relief, of apprehension. She finished serving her table, then discreetly made her way towards them, her movements cautious, her gaze unwavering. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought you were dead." "I almost was," he replied, his voice low. "But Lillian, she saved me. She found me." Anya looked at Lillian, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "You're the one he wrote about," she said, her voice soft. "The woman he loved." Lillian nodded, her heart filled with a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a touch of jealousy. She knew that Anya had shared a bond with Nathaniel, a bond forged in danger, in shared purpose, in a world of secrets and lies. "We need your help, Anya," Nathaniel said, his voice urgent. "We need your testimony. We need you to help us expose the Society of Shadows, to bring them to justice." Anya hesitated, her eyes flickering with fear. "It's dangerous," she said, her voice low. "They have eyes and ears everywhere. They won't hesitate to silence me." "We'll protect you," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "We'll get you to safety. We'll make sure your story is heard." Anya looked at Lillian, then back at Nathaniel, her expression resolute. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it.
For you.
For Nathaniel. And for the truth." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With Anya's help, they gathered evidence, documented the crimes of the Society of Shadows, exposed their network of influence, their manipulation of the war, their plans for the future. They worked with Ambassador Beaumont, with the French authorities, with a handful of trusted officials in the American government, men and women who were determined to root out the corruption, to bring the conspirators to justice. The story broke, a scandal that rocked the world, exposing the dark underbelly of power, the hidden forces that had shaped the course of history. The members of the Society of Shadows were arrested, tried, and convicted, their names forever tarnished, their legacies destroyed. Nathaniel and Lillian returned to America, to Washington, a city transformed, a city cleansed, a city reborn. They testified before Congress, their words echoing through the halls of power, their courage inspiring a nation. They rebuilt their lives. Together, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They bought a small house in Georgetown, not far from the townhouse where Lillian had lived, where she had discovered the letter that had changed everything. They filled their home with light, with laughter, with the memories of their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. They honored the past, but they embraced the future, a future filled with promise, with possibility, with the enduring power of love. The nightmares slowly faded, replaced by shared dreams. Years passed. They never forgot the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made, the price of freedom, the cost of truth. They lived a quiet life, a life of purpose, of service, of unwavering commitment to each other, to the ideals they had fought for. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in their garden, surrounded by roses, lilies, and violets, the flowers of their secret code, the symbols of their enduring love, Lillian turned to Nathaniel, her eyes shining with a lifetime of shared memories. "We did it, Nathaniel," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching for his. "We survived. We protected. We resisted." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand clasping hers. "We did it together, my love," he said, his voice filled with a love that had defied death, that had conquered darkness, that would endure forever.